All right. So this, for those joining us in the audience, is the MAA panel, Medieval Temporalities and Christian Interpretation. Thank you very much to the panelists for being here under these unusual circumstances. Just as a reminder to everyone participating and asking questions, the Medieval Academy of America Professional Behavior Policy also applies to the virtual conference. And if you have questions to ask our panelists, please send them to the email address in the chat, info@themedievalacademy.org. Our three panelists today are Maggie Crosland from the Courtauld Institute of Art, Adrian McClure from Purdue, and Joanna Murdoch from Duke. Are you three ready to get started? Great. So our first speaker is Maggie Crosland. Maggie is in the final year of her PhD at the Courtauld Institute of Art, supervised by Dr. Alex Bovey and Professor Susie Nash. Her dissertation explores the function and adaptation of illuminated prayer books in late medieval Northern Europe, with the Hours of Philip the Bold serving as a central case study. Maggie is an associate lecturer at the Courtauld. She received her BA at Bowdoin College and her MA in the history of art at the Courtauld. Her paper is titled Temporal Ascent, Considering the Visual Traditions of the Gradual Psalms in Relation to Devotional Time. Maggie.
Thank you very much. And let me just bring my PowerPoint onto the screen. Thank you very much, Marian, for the introduction and for leading our panel. And I would also like to thank Maureen Miller, Catherine O'Brien O'Keefe, and the entire program committee for their incredible work in not only putting together the full 2020 program, but also for keeping this conference going in such extraordinary circumstances. In the 1404 inventory of Philip the Bold, the first Valois Duke of Burgundy, is a manuscript described as, quote, 2 large books of hours, of Our Lady of the Cross, of the Holy Spirit, of the dead, and several prayers and other things, used every day in the oratory of my Lord. This 2-volume manuscript, which was commissioned by the Duke for his own use in 1376, is today known as the Hours of Philip the Bold, and is the central case study of my doctoral research. In my paper today, I will focus in particular on one miniature found on folio 57 recto of this manuscript, in which Philip the Bold kneels with his arms crossed in front of himself, with his head lowered in front of a staircase, which bends upward towards an image of the crucified Christ on an altar. Specifically, I will consider this miniature in the context of the intended function of this manuscript, and how such a small painting that introduces a relatively minor text may reflect broader notions of functionality and devotional time. Now, to begin to consider just what is going on with this miniature, I first need to introduce the manuscript itself. The Hours of Philip the Bold is the only known book of hours that the Duke had commissioned for his own use, and it is an immensely complicated object. It was made originally in 2 volumes, now in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge and the Royal Library in Brussels, and it was significantly adapted in the 15th century by Philip's grandson, Philip the Good, who had so many texts added to it that the now Cambridge Codex was split into a 3rd volume, which is now also in Brussels. The volumes together contain roughly 150 miniatures, and the textual contents of the manuscript are equally expansive. They include the principal elements of a book of hours, as well as a number of other texts, including various masses. The miniature in question opens one of these additional texts, which is the Gradual Psalms. This grouping of 15 Psalms, Vulgate 119 through 133, was also called the Songs of Ascents, has long been associated with the stairway made up of 15 steps in the Temple of Jerusalem, as it is recorded in the Midoth that the Levites would sing or chant these psalms while ascending the steps to the temple. Added to the divine office in the Carolingian period, the Gradual Psalms can be seen as some way as analogous to the 7 penitential psalms, as throughout the Middle Ages they were viewed as a unit. However, unlike the 7 penitential psalms, which are found in nearly every book of hours, the gradual psalms are far less common. They are associated more with English books of hours than French examples, and their popularity waned in the late Middle Ages, so that by the end of the 14th century, they were a comparative rarity. A result of this is that there has not been a defined visual tradition for images that accompany the 15 psalms. The initial that opens the gradual psalms in the Mirthly Hours, a book of hours made in Paris at the end of the 13th century, for instance, presents a woman who is presumably the owner of the manuscript kneeling and reading from a prayer book, with Christ looking down at her from above. Others focus on King David as the author of some of the gradual psalms, such as in this example from 13th century Lille. A notable variation is in the de Braille's Hours, illuminated in the mid-13th century in Oxford, in which each of the 15 psalms is introduced with a miniature that relates either to the Old Testament story of Susanna or to the life of St. Lawrence. The miniature in the Hours of Philip the Bold falls within a different pictorial tradition altogether, one in which the 15 steps of the Temple of Jerusalem are depicted. This is found in a few other manuscripts, including a late 13th century book of hours known as the Nuremberg Hours on the far left, and in the mid-15th century prayer book of Alfonso V of Aragon on the far right. What initially caught my eye about the gradual psalms miniature in Philip's manuscript was what seemed to me to be a pictorial error. As you can see in this slide, a full staircase of 15 steps are seen in the Nuremberg and Aragon examples. However, in the Hours of Philip the Bold, there appears to be only 7.5. Why exactly there seems to be an incorrect number of steps in this miniature is impossible to say with certainty, but there are a few likely explanations. The most obvious is that the artist simply did not have room to depict the entire staircase. This is a small 8-line miniature, and in the few other examples where the steps are painted in their entirety, the miniatures tend to be much larger. That in the Nuremberg Hours, for instance, takes up 3/4 of the folio, allowing the full set of steps to reach across the painted space. Given the size constraint to the painted area in the Hours of Philip the Bold, the depiction of 7.5 steps may serve a dual purpose. 7.5 is, not to point out the obvious, half of 15. It could very well reference the total number of steps typically depicted in the gradual psalms. Further, that half step at the bottom edge implies a continuation, as if the additional 7.5 steps could be just beyond the fictive border of the miniature. Complementing or possibly complicating this is the fact that there may actually be 15 steps, at least artistically speaking. If you count the rise and tread of each step separately, then there are exactly 15 stair components. Given the limited surface space allotted for this miniature, this may have been a clever trick on the artist, currently attributed to the master of the Grands Arts, to condense a substantial architectural feature into that space. Still, given the relative rarity of the gradual psalms by the late 14th century, there is a chance that the artist was not familiar with this pictorial tradition. It is very possible that the artist responsible for this miniature did not have a direct model for stair-based gradual psalms imagery and had to draw from other sources. The only other Valois manuscript that I know of that includes the gradual psalms is the Savoy Hours, in which Philip's brother, Charles V, added the psalms to this early 14th century manuscript. And although this section of the manuscript was destroyed in a fire in 1904, they were recorded by Paul Durieux as being introduced by a miniature of Charles in prayer, but with no mention of steps. Still, it must be considered that the Hours of Philip the Bold was made within a circle of manuscripts produced for members of the French royal family in the second half of the 14th century, and shared texts, images, and image types are found throughout a group of manuscripts attributed to a small group of artists that include the Master of the Bible of Jean de Say, the Master of the Coronation Book of Charles V, two of the artists responsible for Philip's manuscript, and Jean Lenoir. I show, for instance, just one of the many visual similarities found between the Hours of Philip the Bold on the left and the Petit Air of Jean de Berry, Philip's brother, on the right. These were illuminated by the Master of the Coronation Book of Charles V and Jean Lenoir, respectively. Concerning step-based imagery, there is at least one example in this group, which is found in a miniature that opens a text concerning the throne of charity that is in a prayer book that belonged to Philip's mother, Bonne of Luxembourg. I don't want to suggest that this miniature or its pattern was the source for that in Philip's manuscript, but I do think it might be the type of image that the artist may have been looking to. Now, up until this point, I've been talking in hypotheticals or posing unanswerable questions. Could there be 7.5 steps? Could there be 15? Perhaps it was a visual solution of the artist, or the artist making do with a limited understanding of a particular pictorial tradition. And in reality, I do not think the exact number of steps matters too much, as their inclusion as is still satisfies one of the purposes of the miniature, which is to introduce the text of the Gradual Psalms with step-based imagery. The far more interesting question to me is why this particular image was chosen to open the Gradual Psalms, and how it is reflective of the function of the prayer book as a whole. Key to answering this is the image of Philip the Bold seen in the bottom left of the scene. The Gradual Psalms image is one of 19 miniatures within the manuscript in which Philip is shown in prayer. These prayer portraits serve as intercessory images, depicting Philip in active prayer before particular saints or devotional relics. 15 of the portraits are in fact located in the miniatures accompanying suffrages to particular saints. These are not, of course, physiognomic likenesses, but rather images designed to prompt the reader, in this case Philip, to reflect on the self in front of the self, acting as a vehicle for the Duke to both mirror and scrutinize himself in the act of worship. A crucial element of these prayer portraits is the emphasis placed on granted vision and spiritual access. In these miniatures, Philip is not physically in front of the object of his prayer. Rather, in almost every prayer portrait, he kneels in prayer and contemplation within a prayer tent, separated from the scene in front of him. This remains true in the Gradual Psalms miniature, as Philip kneels with his arms across his chest, confined within the space of the green tent, as the staircase appears before him. The importance of granted vision is, in fact, key to understanding this miniature in particular. The association between the Gradual Psalms and the Gradual Psalms and the 15 steps to the temple were by the late Middle Ages conflated with the story of the Virgin's presentation in the temple as incorporated into the Golden Legend. According to this, as a child, Mary was brought to the temple, where she climbed the 15 steps unaided, and afterward received daily visions of God. This story was depicted in its own right, and one of the most famous examples is Taddeo Gaddi's fresco of the scene in the Baroncelli Chapel in Santa Croce in Florence, which was famously translated into the Purification of the Virgin in Jean de Berry's Très Richer. It was also represented in its own right in private devotional books, and here I show you a depiction of the presentation of the temple in the Neville of Hornby hours. I think the conflation of these narratives is what is going on in the Nuremberg hours, which I showed earlier, in which the female supplicant and presumable owner of the book ascends the steps towards a vision of God the Father. In the hours of Philip the Bold, Philip is not climbing the steps, but is rather contemplating them. While it is the crucified Christ, rather than God the Father, who is placed at the altar at the top of the steps, I think it must still relate to the daily vision received by the Virgin. The steps lead to Christ, or the vision of Christ, and through the recitation and contemplation of the Gradual Psalms, Philip is provided with visual and textual instruction to receive the same type of daily spiritual vision. The daily temporal aspect of this narrative is equally important and may relate to why the Gradual Psalms were chosen for inclusion in this manuscript in the first place. Daily use is inherent to the definition of a book of hours as a genre, as it is essentially a condensed version of the divine office made for a lay audience through which they could mirror their devotional practices on the monastic community. The notion of time in a book of hours is immensely complicated and is expressed in multiple ways. For example, the core text of the Book of Hours, the Hours of the Virgin, were meant to be read not only every day, but were divided over the canonical hours of the day, prompting the reader to contemplate, and in doing so condense, the entire life of the Virgin over the course of a single day on a daily basis. I don't want to go too in-depth into this as a subject, but I do think the importance of time in relation to the spiritual literacy is absolutely crucial for the function of the Gradual Psalms and its accompanying miniature. The introduction of the Gradual Psalms into the divine office is attributed to the 7th century Benedictine monk, Saint Benedict of Aniene, who instructed that monks should read the 15 Psalms privately every day before Matins. This practice was codified in England in the 10th century Regulars Concordia, and according to Victor Leroquet, this practice continued throughout the Middle Ages across Europe. That these were texts that were meant to be read every day is indirectly suggested in the Gradual Psalms miniature by means of the Duke's clothing. While in the miniature, the Duke is depicted in a blue cloak with a white lining with his hands crossed before him, his arm posture varies from prayer portrait to prayer portrait, and his clothing alternates in shades of red and blue. Aside from providing visual variation to the leaves of the prayer book, these differences almost certainly relate to both heraldic colors and Dominican ways of praying. They also effectively show Philip in prayer within the manuscript on different days, reinforcing the daily spiritual task of reading from his hours. Of course, how a manuscript was intended to function versus how it was actually used is an important distinction. Frustratingly, how often books of hours were actually used by their owners is an unanswerable question. But in the case of the hours of Philip the Bold, there is some archival evidence to suggest the frequency with which the Duke used his manuscript. I return to the inventory entry with which I began my paper, which states that the Duke used his hours every day in his oratory. While we need to be careful not to read the wording of this entry too literally, the description of Philip's daily use of the manuscript is important for our purposes. What is recorded here is a description to distinguish this particular manuscript from many others in the library after the Duke's death. And here that description is, this is the book of hours he used all the time. As an art historian interested in the usability of objects, this of course is very exciting, as it provides at least partial insight into the importance placed on personal use and habitual use, whether actually by Philip or at least perceived by those in his court. I'm not suggesting that Philip the Bold looked at the Gradual Psalms miniature every day, or that he chanted the Psalms daily at Matins. But if we are to begin to understand how a prayer book as complicated as the Hours of Philip the Bold was used, we first have to consider how it was meant to function, and even the smallest of images help us to piece together a greater understanding of this. To quote Michael Baxendale, on one side there was a painter who made the picture, or at least supervised its making. On the other side, there was somebody else who asked him to make it, provided funds for him to make it, and after he had made it, reckoned on using it in some way or other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for that fascinating paper and great images. We're going to hold questions and discussions until the end of the panel. So up next is our next speaker, Adrian McClure. There we go. Adrian is a PhD candidate at Purdue University. His research focuses on the intersection of medieval literature and religious identity, with an emphasis on trauma theory and gender studies. He is currently finishing his dissertation, Haunted by Heresy, the Perslesvaus Medieval Antisemitism, and the Albigensian Crusade. His interdisciplinary study In the Name of Charlemagne, Roland, and Turpin, Reading the Oxford Roland as a Trinitarian Text, was published in Speculum this April. Adrian's paper is titled The Temporality of Trauma, Defective Exegesis and the Collapse of Supersessionist Identity in the Perslesvaus. Adrian.
Okay. Okay. Temporal. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you fine, Adrian.
Okay, good. Temporality was experienced in a number of richly resonant ways throughout the Middle Ages, from the cyclic, ever-turning wheel of fortune to the unlinear unfolding of salvation history to the chord-like convergences of typology. There were also, however, moments of breakdown where traditional constructions of time seemed to fall out of sync with lived experience. In this talk, we'll explore one such moment of breakdown, as encoded with the temporal perturbations of the Perslesvaus, a 13th century old French Grail romance renowned for its crusading zeal, disturbing hyperviolence, and unusual typological focus on the battle between the old and new law. These perturbations, I will argue, elusively enact the broken temporality of trauma, a trauma associated with a hitherto unrecognized crisis of Christian identity, triggered by the brutal onset of internal crusading with the Albigensian Crusade. First, I'll begin by positioning the Perslesvaus as a work of trauma fiction. After that, we'll take the look at 2 episodes of temporal breakdown involving clerical exegesis within the world of the romance. In both cases, we'll see the spiritual commentary being offered is A, almost aggressively defective, and B, problematically focused on supersessionism, that is, the Christian interpretive framework in which Christians are seen as superseding Jews as the new chosen people of God. Finally, I'll relate these exegetical and temporal collapses to the special circumstances of the Albigensian Crusade and the fundamental collapse of the self-conception of Christian identity. Let's start with the Perslesvaus as a work of trauma fiction. Anne Whitehead, an early consensus builder in the often troubled field of literary trauma studies, has identified the principal markers of a trauma fiction as the following: extreme repetition, spectrality, problematic intertextuality, and severe distortions of space, time, and narration that are pushed to the point of epistemological breakdown. All these traits are abundantly present in the Perslesvaus. From its miraculously mutating landscape to its constant recurrence of severed heads and dead bodies and the confusion of identity surrounding these relics, to the strange divergences from the core Arthurian narratives, like the fact that the action is focused on Arthurian restaging of the battle between the old and the new law, in which the forces of resurgent old law are led by none other than the brother of the Fisher King, who does not occur in any other source. But if I had to pick just one episode that most clearly conveys the traumatic echo chamber of horrors quality of this text, it would probably be the penance of the Lady of the Castle of Beards, in which Arthur, Gawain, and Lancelot fight off escalating waves of bigger and bigger demon knights, armed with flaming weapons. Shrieks fill the night air as the bodies of the slain demon knights disintegrate into ash and excrement, and their damned souls fly off in the form of crows. So I hope that you're willing to accept that this text qualifies as trauma literature. To go back to Whitehead's criteria, we have plenty of compulsive repetition, strange use of intertextuality, spatial anomalies, and spectrality. This includes 2 criteria of Whitehead's that we will examine here: disordered temporality and narrative voice. In the Perslesvaus, the 2 are eminently interconnected in the first of 2 exegetical interludes that I now want to explore. An episode from Branch 5 set in the aptly titled Castle of Inquiry. The Perslesvaus, like the Vulgate Caisse de Saint-Gall, features hermits and priests who provide after-the-fact spiritual explanations of the knight's adventures within the story, positioning these romances as the fictional equivalent of glossed scholarly text. The Perslesvaus has 2 such interludes, the first of which takes place just before the culmination of Gawain's failed Grail quest to the castle bordering the land of the Fisher King. As he enters the Castle of Inquiry, Gawain is in a deeply confused and troubled state, and he is consequently thrilled to hear that the high priest of that castle is ready to explain the signifiance, or the allegorical meaning, of his perplexing adventures. Of these, the most disturbing is the brutal murder of a beautiful and gracious lady with whom Gawain took lodging overnight. Although both Gawain, who was practicing celibacy during his Grail quest, and the lady had behaved with perfect propriety, her jealous husband shows up the next morning and assumes the worst. While Gawain is outside, the husband drags the wife off by her hair, strips off her clothing, whips her viciously across her back and breast, and then sticks her in a freezing pool in the forest until its waters run red. When Gawain hears her scream and tries to rescue her, he is tricked by the husband, who agrees to a joust and then swerves at the last moment and impales his wife, only to rush off to the safety of the castle before Gawain can avenge her. 3 later encounters with related characters, the last of which is immediately prior to Gawain's entry to the land of the Fisher King, keep the pain and confusion surrounding this episode fresh in our eyes. So by the time the gates of the Castle of Inquiry swing open, readers like Gawain are hoping for some insight and closure on the single most disturbing episode of this unsettling romance. And here, in its entirety, is what the high priest has to say about it. There was great joy in the signifiance of her death, for Josephus tells us that the old law was struck down by the thrust of a lance without resurrection. To strike down the old law, God suffered himself to be stabbed in the side of a lance. And by that blow in his crucifixion, the old law was struck down. The lady signifies the old law. Now we'll return to Josephus, the principal authority figure in this text, in just a moment. But for now, let's concentrate on the exegesis itself. Gawain, when he hears the high priest's take on this, is delighted. His perplexity is wiped away. His distress at the lady's death evaporates, and he leaves his interlocutor a joy at his heart. The readers and listeners, however, are left totally shocked. How can this brutal murder, condemned as deeply wrongful not only by Gawain himself, but by numerous other characters, including a holy hermit, possibly be glossed so positively and accepted so swiftly? All kinds of factors, both textual and exegetical, scream out that this rushed commentary is deeply defective. Medieval exegesis could often have an arbitrary flavor, yes, and negative events could be given a positive spin, as with the fall being typologically celebrated as the felix culpa. But in this case, the gap between the emotional weight of the original incident and the breezy assurance of the exegesis is too great for the audience to follow Gawain into his headlong leap of interpretive trust. This is especially the case because the exegesis itself is so problematic. The narrative has shown us a caring, gracious, and virtuous woman who was killed being pierced by a lance right after being brutally scourged by a cruel, scheming, and carnal husband who seemingly personifies all of the negative medieval stereotypes about Judaism. But instead of being glossed as a martyred type of Christ, as every narrative consideration would seem to suggest, the murdered lady is glossed as a type of the old law. This topsy-turvy typologizing, in other words, in which a woman has never before been associated with the old law and who has been presented as an obvious type of the suffering Christ, is suddenly identified as Judaism incarnate. The suspicion arises that something is very troubling is occurring at the boundary of Christian and Jewish identity. This exegetical collapse, moreover, is accompanied by a temporal meltdown. I have already alluded to the fact that the clerkly Josephus is the principal authority figure for this romance. The old French narrator tells us at one point that Josephus is the first priest to celebrate the Eucharist, already a bit of a temporal problem in the Arthurian romance. And we are also led to told that he originally recorded these adventures directly from a dictating angel, to which the pronouncements of the Holy Spirit are also added. But as you may have already noticed, the pronouncements of the high priest of the Castle of Inquiry also cites the authority of Josephus. What we have, in other words, is a very bad case of what narratologists term metalepsis, a problematic collapse between different frames of narrative, where Josephus both writing down a story he received from on high and serving as a kind of script advisor to the exegesis side. Now, no matter how you try and twist this, you can't make sense of this temporally. Even if we are trying to say that Josephus originally received the tale as a prophetic revelation and then tutored the exegetes, how has commentary from the tale they dispensed found a way into the tale itself? There is a temporal paradox here that cannot be evaded. That is, the problematic temporality might have something to do with supersessionism and salvation history, is strongly suggested by the fact that Josephus himself is seen by most scholars as a fictional stand-in for Flavius Josephus, the first century Romano-Jewish historian whose Jewish wars served as a kind of fifth gospel in the Middle Ages. In particular, Josephus's works were seen as verifying the supersessionist narrative, in which the destruction of Jerusalem under Vespasian was glossed as payback for the crucifixion, and signaled the turning point where Christians became the new chosen people of God. Here, this Josephus is being collapsed with Joseph of Arimathea, who, in the Grail narrative following Robert de Boron, is the founder of the Grail Brotherhood and the ancestor of Perslesvaus. So once again, with this weird suturing of a canonical Jewish historian with the first celebrant of the Christian Eucharist, we can detect concern over collapsing Christian Jewish identity. We can see the same anxieties operating even more clearly in the text's second interlude of internal exegesis, to which I will now turn. In this interlude, which occurs 3 branches later, the protagonist whose adventures are being glossed is the Grail hero himself, Perslesvaus, and the holy exegete, who uncovers their hidden meaning as Pelles, the hermit king, Perslesvaus' maternal uncle and the good brother of the fisher king. By far the longest section of Pelles' exegesis, and the part I'll focus here, concerns Perslesvaus' visionary encounter with a white beast in the forest. Here's how the original adventure unfolds. While on his way to recapture the Grail castle after the fisher king has died and his evil apostate brother, the king of Castle Mortal, has assumed control, Perslesvaus comes across a red cross in a clearing in the forest. A white-clad knight and a maiden holding golden vessels watch from the shadow of the trees as a small pregnant white animal, possibly an ermine, with emerald green eyes enters the clearing. She is in great distress due to the turbulent yelping litter she carries inside her. In her desperation, the small white beast runs to Perslesvaus, but the relief she craves is not to be. As she prepares to jump up to the Grail hero's saddle and he readies his hands to catch her, the white-clad knight steps forward to intervene. The creature's peril is not his or anyone else's concern, he sternly informs Perslesvaus, and she must fulfill her destiny. Accepting that she will have no rescuer, the white beast then approaches the cross at the center of the clearing, at which point her litter is born and proves to comprise of 12 ravening dogs. As she lies supine before them, quote, as if she was begging for mercy, unquote, her canine offspring collectively attack her and rip her body into shreds with their teeth, although they are unable, the text informs us, either to ingest her flesh or to pull her bloody remains away from the cross. Following this grisly scene of matricidal dismemberment, the 12 murderous dogs run off into the woods. No sooner have they departed than the white-clad knight and maiden enter the clearing and begin reverently collecting up the white beast's scattered flesh and blood from the ground along the red cross, placing the remains in their golden vessels before disappearing back to the forest. Now, before I comment on this nightmarish vision, let us take a look at the signifiance that the text provides. When Perslesvaus finally arrives at the hermitage of his uncle Peles, the hermit king barely pauses before launching into an explanation of his adventures. Unsurprisingly, the white beast herself turns out to represent Christ on the cross, while the litter of 12 dogs, also unsurprisingly, represent the 12 tribes of Israel who are held collectively responsible for his passion and crucifixion. But the details and development of Peles' exegesis are certainly surprising, and once again they turn out to repair problematic supersessionist typologizing with temporal collapse. Peles' exegesis on this episode, by far the longest in the romance, centers on a retelling of the Old Testament manna story. And Peles' vision was differ significantly from the account of Exodus and Numbers. The story is twisted to foreground the guilt and misdeeds of the Jewish people. As Peles tells the story, when God sends the miraculous bread to feed his starving people in the wilderness, it is not just some of the Israelites, but the entire community from Moses on downwards who start hoarding the manna. And when they discover their stockpiles have turned into reptiles and vermin, rather than as being infested by maggots, as in the biblical version, they are overcome with consciousness of their wrongdoing and, in a truly startling departure from the historical framework of salvation history, immediately disperse into unknown lands. Peles then finishes off his exercise in fevered anti-Semitic exegesis with a typological leap across the centuries to the crucifixion. Worthy nephew, he recaps, the 12 dogs are the Jews who God nourished and who were born into the law, which he established, but never wanted to believe him or love him. Instead, they crucified him and broke his body as vilely as they could. Now, it would be possible to give a whole talk on the bizarre aspects of Perslesvaus' vision and the exegesis given by Peles, but here I will only point out two. First, in the original vision, having a maternal Christ depicted as giving birth in the crucifixion to the church or to Reformed Christians was a common enough trope, as Carolyn Walker Bynum has shown us. However, the maternal Jesus figured in form of a small terrified animal who gives birth to Jewish dogs who tear her apart is problematic in the extreme. Not only is Christ himself reduced to distressing levels of powerlessness and the dignity of his death lost in frenzied dismemberment, but his precious flesh and blood is allowed into the mouths of unclean dogs, however unable they may be to ingest it. This vision, in sort, definitely does not conform to the convention of 13th century effective piety, blood-soaked though it could be, but paints a horrifying picture of divine abjection and desecration. This is a vision in which Christ is so powerless he looks to the human Grail hero for protection, and which his divine flesh and blood are chewed over and spat out by dogs. Secondly, Peles' latter exegesis of this violent vision violates the most fundamental principle of Christian typology, the alignment of the Old and New Testament, by never connecting it to Christ's living bread. Incredibly, his commentary on a vision in which white-clad figures collect up the flesh and blood in golden vessels never once mentions the Eucharist. Instead, these figures are bizarrely asserted to represent the divinity of the Father. Thus, in place of the complex logic of traditional Christian allegorical reading, in which Old Testament shadow prefigures New Testament truth, the logic of fulfillment and advanced spiritual enlightenment across the redemptive unfolding of salvation history, we are instead presented with a complete collapse of temporality in which the diaspora occurs before the Israelites have even stepped foot in the promised land. In Peles' rewriting of the Old Testament, God shows no partiality or forbearance to the Jewish people either individually or collectively, and the stigma of Christ killing is extended across the ages. In essence, all sense of salvation history is ruthlessly sacrificed to establish the eternal perfidy of the Jews. It is now my time to turn to my own exegesis of these exegetical breakdowns. It's due to its time constraints will have to be ruthlessly pruned down to two main points. First, as I think even this short talk has demonstrated, the problematic internal exegesis of the Perslesvaus cannot be dismissed as an accidental consequence of sloppy thinking, poor taste, and bloodthirsty religious zeal, as has often been the case in Perslesvaus criticism. Rather, careful examination in its exegesis in its narrative context suggests this is a textbook work of trauma literature staging a profound crisis of Christian identity. From St. Paul onwards, one of the central pillars of Christian identity via Jewish identity was their deeper level of spiritual understanding, whereas in the Christian type framework of typological salvation history, Jews read scriptures blindly, apprehending only their literal meaning, where Christians penetrate to the dead letter to access living allegorical truths. Thus, exegesis, in an important sense, undergirded Christian exceptionalism and validated their status as the chosen people of God. From this perspective, the defective exegesis of the Perslesvaus and the temporal collapse that accompanies it are not accidental but central. They are encoding traumatic anxieties that Christian supersessionist identity is collapsing, and that God's new chosen people are reverting into the role that they had assigned to the reviled and scapegoated Jews. The shadowy half-Christian, half-Jewish authority figure of Josephus perfectly embodies this traumatic anxiety. The second point I want to make is that these anxieties have a compelling historical context, the brutal onslaught of internal crusading. The first third of the 13th century witnessed this 20-year on-again, off-again course of the Albigensian Crusade, the first papal crusade to be directed at heretics rather within Western Christendom rather than Eastern schismatics or Saracen unbelievers. Its target, as you may know, were the quote-unquote Cathars of southern France, whom the church regarded as dangerous dualist heretics, but who often presented themselves with a good deal of popular support as reformers advocating a return to purer apostolic traditions. Now, whatever their actual beliefs and practices, these persecuted Christians were widely perceived as ascetic anti-materialists who went as far as rejecting the humanity of Christ and the carnal and corrupt Old Testament. Such perceptions were bound to trouble supersessionist framework of identity that posits Christian spiritual superiority. This is especially the case when we factor in the notorious killings, burnings, maimings, and atrocities that were regularly perpetrated by the crusading forces, and so Christians took on the role of persecutors that they had cast Jews in. Now, the idea of the Perslesvaus as a traumatic response to the special circumstances of the Albigensian Crusade is evident in all kinds of ways that I don't have space to get into now. But they're thoroughly canvassed in my thesis, Haunted by Heresy. What I've tried to make clear today is that one of the most powerful discourses of anxiety in this traumatized text is its defective internal exegesis, whose temporal collapse and problematic typology stage a profound collapse of Christian identity associated with internal crusading. All too often, religious discourse and secular literature is ignored and treated as a kind of pious window dressing. In the Perslesvaus, as we have seen, it is revelatory. Thank you.
Adrian, thank you so much for your paper. Once again, moving right along, and please do send any questions about Adrian's paper or Maggie's paper to that address in the chat, info@medievalacademy.org. So send in your questions and we'll get to them after Joanna's paper, which is up next. Joanna Murdoch is a doctoral candidate in English literature at Duke University. Her dissertation traces the transmission history of late medieval prayer poems, drawing on lyric studies, reception theory, and material philology. She thanks the MAA and the Richard III Society for the Shalek Award that supported her research for this paper and a dissertation chapter it springs from. Her paper is titled Time and Devotional Poetics in John Lydgate's Kalendarium. Joanna.
Very much. Okay, let's share this. Oh, I have to hit share. And Off we go. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And I'm so excited to talk more about both of my co-panelist papers. They're fascinating. Mine, as you can see, is called Time and Devotional Poetics in John Lydgate's Kalendarium. What makes a poem a poem? I try my best to answer this question empirically with a blend of cultural materialism, historical poetics, and so on, all good, necessary approaches. But I can't deny the power in personal histories of reading over time. Beowulf is a poem, to me, because my favorite teacher in college played us Seamus Heaney reading his translation. What a voice. What John Donne and Emily Dickinson wrote count as poems for me because my study abroad crush wrote them out in pen for us to read together. Those poems' writers were themselves affected by other poems and the communities gathered around them, and back, a vast web of encounter. As many others have argued, there's something fundamentally social and relational in the experience of recognizing, reading, and valuing a text as a poem. So I'd like to bring a new old poem into this conversation. John Lydgate's 15th century Kalendarium, a prayer in 52 rhyme royal stanzas addressed to all the saints whose feasts fill out the liturgical church year. Here is a shot of the opening stanzas for January, which I draw from a 20th century print edition. The manuscript settings of this poem are fascinating and great, although nothing can compete with miniature illustrations and books of hours, Maggie. But to keep things clear for people who might be calling in from all over, I'm just using the print edition here with all its quirks. So I'll just read the 7 first lines so you get a sense of how the poem sounds and works. O Jesu Lord, for the circumcision, in the beginning as of the new year, keep me ever from all confusion, when that I shall stand at mine answer. Lord, grant me grace well for to appear, and for the worshipful epiphany, grant thou me good lief and well for to dee. So why this poem for this panel, other than its clear temporality, marker? Well, I'm a sucker for the virtuosic and also for the underdog, and this poem is both of those things. It's overlooked. Few scholars have done more than list it as among Lydgate's verse creations, and any mention it has garnered tends to be neutral or often dismissive. It's actually been overlooked for the same reason I call it virtuosic. The poem has a lot of working parts and rules that govern its structure, and they go on without change or really progression for 365 lines. So the effect for modern readers can be a bit dull. It's certainly not as page-turning as the Perslesvaus. But the poem is fascinating, I argue. It has much to offer in terms of interactions between temporal modes. Plus, it shows some of what non-narrative poetry could do well before English lyric as a written form really took off in the 16th and 17th centuries. So who is Lydgate, if you're not familiar with him? He's Chaucer's main fanboy. He was born 1370, died 1449. He was a Benedictine monk and prolific writer, remembered for his indebtedness to Chaucer, his long-windedness, and his amazing generic breadth. He comes into my research on devotional poetics because he wrote many poems that spring from the structures of late medieval religious practice. And just a quick aside on the word devotional, I'm using it kind of like Eamon Duffy, whose book Stripping of the Altars about traditional religion in England is fantastic. I mean sort of private religious practice, which can still be had in community with others, even in the mass, but it sort of pertains to the individual's experience and intentions and habits. Once thought to be the dull, self-busying exercises of a monkish poet, Lydgate's devotional pieces have recently been gaining in importance for his estimation as wordsmith. I think that's because these poems betray a clear impulse toward formal experimentation and conceptual flexibility. Lydgate is infamously into expansion, taking things and making them longer, and sometimes you wonder, was it really necessary? But he's also very much about taking things that are already potent and often priestly experiences and turning them into poems that could be read by lay people. If you look through his devotional poems, he's often translating visual, spatial, liturgical, and temporal experience into rhyming verse. So we have his exposition on the Paternoster, which he takes each line of the Latin Lord's Prayer and blows it out to a whole stanza of Middle English poetry. We have his suggested inner monologue for kissing the cross at verbum caro factum est. And most famously, we have his Danse of Poulis, a literary adaptation, many say, of the Dance of Death mural that was at the Church of the Holy Innocents in Paris. Now, where some critics have viewed the calendar poem I'm discussing today as little more than a mnemonic exercise for locating, well, whose day is it today? Oh, it's St. Patrick's Day. I read it as part of a 15th century poetic avant-garde belonging generically with the literary translations of religious experience I just listed, a kind of poetizing that does important ethical and spiritual work as it reveals the way its source material, here calendar time, is itself a devotional medium, one that the reader is already caught up in and must learn to value and wield responsibly. So onto the poem. Please buckle up. I'm going to jump straight into the close reading. Had we but world enough and time, there would be much to say about the history of the liturgical calendar, its verse spin-offs, its various kinds of artistic development in books of hours. And then there are the subtle but fascinating differences in each of the 10 or 11 surviving copies of this poem. Enough to fill a dissertation chapter like the one I'm working on right now. And it's still very much in process. So if you have questions or suggestions, they'll be very welcome at the end. Anyway, for today, I'll stick with a few temporal effects that make this poem cohere as a rich devotional artifact built to accrue meaning over years. I'll start with the layers of time that Lydgate draws together in his intercessions to saints, old and new. Then I'll move on to the tensions between poetic measure and calendar time that he uses to penitential effect. And finally, I'll consider a couple of the more interesting nows to which that the poem makes palpable. And here I'm thinking of how medieval literature can show us what Carolyn Dinshaw has called the possibility of a fuller, denser, more crowded now, which is lovely to think of in these times of social distance. Full, dense, and crowded are very apt descriptors for the Kalendarium. Not only is it addressed to the entire crowded company of heaven, but it rests in a pretty involved and crowded visual setting as well, in all of its surviving versions, as well as the modern printed editions by Karl Horstmann and Henry McCracken. Here is a detailed shot of the month of June on the left from the Oxford Bodleian Library Deuce 322. And on the right, you can see just sort of like a generic non-poem liturgical calendar that I got from the public domain, and it says it's of Finnish origin, but you can see how similar they are, but also a few of the differences. The scribe of Deuce 322 on the left has placed Lydgate's poem in the traditional calendar's frame with all the columns. And if you are interested in those symbols and numbers and letters, I recommend Roger Wick's book, The Medieval Calendar. It's like an exhibition catalog, but it's beautifully written and very instructive for learning to read these complicated forms. But I'm not talking about that today. The presentation we have in front of us means that instead of being offered a simple start to end linear read of the poem, anyone encountering it would find his or her way in via the red lettering for the saints' days, or via the speech act of the prayer, or the columns on the left, which tell you the days of the week and the days of the month and the lucky and unlucky days. Plus, we have all these annotations in the manuscripts, which would make for a cool paper later on. Some of them have astrological notes like Sol in Libris, and some of them have amens indicating that some people were actually reading this as a devotional act of prayer. But what kind of temporality is on offer here, putting this poem in this kind of frame? I'd argue that it's something cyclical yet progressing forward, as the poem's linking to the church year invites it to be read and reread repeatedly, with the interactions between all the elements in it sort of growing on you over time. So let's move back to the January detail for a closer look. I read you the first stanza. I'll read the second one briefly. Now pray for me, blessed Saint Lucian, that I might be had forth unto your dance. There God ruleth both angel and man, in right true love without invariance. Give me some comfort, as of acquaintance, confessor and bishop Saint Hilary, with good Saint Felix that joyeth they be. What's happening here is that the traditional calendar's listing of saints' days and other church feasts has been turned into running, rhyming 4 and 5 beat verse. The bolding you see here, or the red lettering in some of the manuscript settings, sets off the feasts and the saints' names in question from the connective tissue of prayer, so that the traditional listing can still be accessed by readers in search of mere temporal reference. There are approximately 200 feasts and saints named in all, starting with Jesus, and moving on, as you see, to Lucian, Hilary, and Felix, and a couple hundred more, whose position in the stanzas perfectly matches their month-day positioning in liturgical calendars according to Saramus. But the poem does something more than simply run through an expanded version of the noteworthy days for each month. In addition to forming a massively complex act of prayer, directed at one divine ear through 200 plus saintly channels, there's another sort of time-telling that rises to the poem's surface if you read it all the way through or read it repeatedly. I mean, it's not hard to see it. Penitential reminders of human mortality. Lydgate juxtaposes swiftly fleeting calendrical dates with reminders of the eternal backdrop to all earthly temporal experience. This double vision takes hold in the very first lines of the poem, in which the beginning, as of the new year, is separated only by a blink and a line of verse from the moment "Whan that I shall stand at min anser." The poet returns frequently to the idea of his pending death and transition to the afterlife, with such references building to a subtle refrain that holds together the many different ideas, addresses, and registers explored over the course of the poem's 52 stanzas. Though each stanza addresses different saints and feasts, the primary poetic actions throughout are the same: supplication, reminders of the limits on earthly life, and the drawing together of past, present, and future in the interests of teaching the reader or encouraging the reader to try to correctly interpret and value each of those timeframes. The rhymes snowball into a system of ordered, if dizzying, interactions between Ave and Christen, members of the body of Christ, so that one can't help but read saints from different historical moments as being in sonorous relation to each other. We have, for instance, looking ahead a little, in this stanza, the first century conversion of St. Paul, as you can see in the 4th line, being invoked in the same breath as Julian and Agnes, who are saints from the 4th century, all of whom are being beseeched in the 15th century and later on behalf of the supplicant's present and anticipated future. Help us to be unbound, like that's yet to come. So a similar sort of temporal blending happens when the lines between the living and the dead are blurred through pronoun substitutions. For example, in the opening stanzas for November, Lydgate pleads for heavenly music to ease the sufferings of souls. He draws a parallel between St. Leonard's harp, which you can see in the 2nd line of the 2nd stanza, and St. Theodore's psaltery, a couple lines later. But the souls being helped are, in the first case, those in purgatory, and in the second case, souls still living on earth. A simple substitution of our for their in the penultimate line seems to have happened at some point in the transmission history, though all the surviving copies I've consulted have that same pronoun our. So with all Halloween in this most high feast, all Christian soul as God gave him good rest, abiding his mercy in purgatory, suffering for her sinners, pain is bitterly. Lord Jesu Christ, though pain has been full sharp, now, Saint Leonard, help us therefore, make them easy with the most docet harp, and the 4 crowned, I pray thou evermore, evermore, helping with the psaltery Saint Theodore, that it may assuage somewhat our great pain, with the prayer of Holy Saint Martin. Whether scribal error or authorial entente, excuse me, this pronoun mixing reflects a fundamental message throughout the poem. Mutual responsibilities within the mystical body of Christ extend well beyond death, which is not new news to medieval Christians. Souls living on earth pray to hasten their families' and friends' progress through purgatory, just as souls in heaven are believed to ease the travails of those who ask for help. So apart from the pronouns I just noted, this kind of temporal blending and blurring happens frequently on a sentence level in Lydgate's poem. And it's mostly because there was not a lot of punctuation happening, or if there was in the different settings, it doesn't seem to have much to do with the actual syntax. There's no way to know, if we return to those January verses we had just looked at, which of the named saints the speaker is imploring for help to escape the wicked fendes brawl. You can see punctuation here, but it's just something that this editor McCracken added in later. The same goes for the plea to keep us from all manner of sin, which you can see just below the 5. Whom is he asking to help us do that? It could fit the syntax equally well were it addressed to Julian, Agnes, or Batilde. Nor does it seem at all urgent to Lydgate or his scribes to separate out these intercessions. Instead, the proliferation of prayer words like with and for and that creates a holistic, mutually ramifying quality to the saints and their salvific work. One last effect unique to a poem like this is the tension it maintains between various modes of temporal measurement. Lydgate's 2 structurally organizing features in this poem, the calendar time and the metrical structure and rhymes, interact complexly throughout. Since each line of the poem represents one of the year's 365 days, the relations between the beginnings of each 7-line ballade stanza, which is another term in this time for rhyme rule, you don't care, and the start and end of each month act exactly like the relations between weeks and months. Sometimes their beginnings and endings coincide cleanly, so the first of the month happens to also be the first day of the week. Other times, the start of the month falls in the middle of a week or stanza. So there's a slight friction that these dual reckoning tracks cause, since the reader's eye naturally looks for beginnings of stanzas and months, while the ear listens for end rhymes and rhythmic cadences, which give the stanzas their shape as you pass through them. Though every month except January involves some degree of this friction, it is clearest when rhyming couplets are separated on either side of the new month's entrance. See, for example, the strange effect created when Aprilis, the month of April, enters just before the end of stanza 13 in March here. There's a stretching of sonic space between the rhyming words Holy Ghost and Ost, as much as there is a stretching of sentence, syntactic space between the stanza's first line and last line across the gap of the new month's entry. So I'll read it for effect. O blessed laddie, with this Emmanuel, now for his glorious resurrection, help us with the angel Gabriel, for his worshipful salutation, and for his marvelous incarnation, which that wrought was through the Holy Ghost. Keep us, laddie, under the blessed Ost. There's a kind of suspense this disjointedness creates, a hastening of words, lines, entities reaching for each other across distances. I think this illustrates, or maybe even enacts, what I take to be Lydgate's belief in a deep cosmic order spanning apparent gaps, conflicts, and separations. And at the heart of that order, a joyful, festive, fundamentally social, mutually dependent pact. So to conclude, we've established there are a lot of temporalities at play in the inner workings of Lydgate's poem. And what we find when we pursue these intricate effects is constant reminders of our being woven together in a capacious present with all other members of Christ's body. But it's not just about being present to each other across removes of time and space. Lydgate's vision of heaven, like Dante's, I think, rests on the belief that we are all responsible for each other's flourishing. I'm not saying that medieval English Christians or any of us today are doing very well at being responsible, as Dostoevsky says, in all sincerity for everything and for everyone. But I find the poem and the prayer very heartening in this season where we're so brutally faced with the power we have over each other's lives, for ill and for good. To conclude the conclusion, I want to walk this back to the question I opened with: what makes a poem a poem? And the instinct that we recognize poetry in large part because we've been shaped by love for other people and their patterns of meaning making. Lydgate's Kalendarium is many things, including a great long poem to read during a pandemic. But what gives me the most joy is that this odd artifact, which is part encyclopedia of the saints, part prayer, part art, has been recorded for posterity in quite a few different contexts that I can't really go into now, I'm sorry. But it's enough to really stretch our vision of what a poem can be or could be or should be, whether in the 15th century or now. The 20th century poet Wallace Stevens famously wrote, "Death is the mother of beauty." And it's easy, especially today, to believe in this scarcity model, the idea that the poet, the critic, the reader are constantly running out of things, out of time, life, value, meaning, things at the grocery store. How different is the model on offer in Lydgate's Kalendarium, which presents time itself as a creative, devotional medium in which desires, intimations of meaning, and attempts to care for one another can be practiced and hopefully perfected year after year. I want to call this a devotional poetics of unfolding, of accrual, something like the line in 2 Peter 3:9, which suggests that time, and I think by extension poetry, keeps stretching on because God wants to see how each soul will work with it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joanna. And thank you to all three of you for those really fascinating interrelated papers. We've heard about temporalities of use, temporalities of historical identity, temporalities of lived experience. We have a number of questions from the audience, but I first wanted to just ask, do the three of you have any questions for each other to kick off this conversation building on these three readings of these complicated medieval engagements with time?
I have a question for Joanna. First of all, to say I immensely enjoyed both of your papers. Maybe this is slightly unfair to pick up on a point you just made in conclusion about not having time to talk about the context, but given the connection to Books of Hours, I have so many questions about the poem, but to ask, where is this found? What types of objects and books is this found in?
Well, chiefly, I mean that I think it's so interesting. So I'm working right at a moment when texts that I'm finding in the same, basically 15 books seem to have literary valences in some cases, or like devotional, like practical valences in others. It's not that they're mutually exclusive, but I do think there is a bit of a distinction. So for example, Harley 4011 at the British Library is a collection of poems by Lydgate, and it's sort of like heavily annotated and decorated, and someone is really loving that this is a collection of poetry. And the calendar poem appears like kind of in the middle of it as a poem among poems. Whereas, so Deuce 322, which is one of the sort of fancier ones that I showed, or I think I showed it side by side with the Finnish one. The poem appears at the very start of the book, like traditional liturgical calendars do, and this effect is sort of strengthened by there's one in Huntington 142, and I'm thinking of another one where the poem is part of this like sequence of things that you're supposed to read all together, and there's an indulgence at the end saying everyone who's prayed the whole thing through gets, hundreds of thousands of years off their time in purgatory. And then finally there's a book at St. John's College in Oxford that has this poem, and it's in addition to, it's like a William Caxton printed book. So it has like manuscript version of this poem, but then print versions of like the life of Cato, or it seems like a kind of hodgepodge of things that buyers might like to have in a commissioned book. I don't know, you sort of get into question territory. So I could go on, but I won't.
Thank you.
And just since I already have the mic, I'll keep going. I also was fascinated by both of your papers, and I think I need more time for everything to kind of come to the surface. So I'll probably be emailing you. But Adrian, I'm really curious about how time works in narrative and how the experience of time, like reading, how those things work together. And I was really curious if you have thoughts about kind of like linear sequence versus like episode stuff in relation to like do you think that the readers of the Perslesvaus would have expected to start it at the beginning and go all the way through? And does that affect some of the temporal disruptions you were talking about?
Well, that's a good question. I don't. There's not a whole lot about the reception of this work in particular. It's a very weird book, and I think historically a lot of people haven't talked about it even when it's been read, and that goes from the Middle Ages to the present because nobody has ever really known what to say about it. It's just too weird, and it's kind of a brain-breaking experience to read it. You can imagine what it's been like to study it for years.
Whoa.
It did kind of prepare me in a way for everything we're going through right now. I will say it's sort of the opposite of what you talked about with it, because it's this sort of proto-dystopian work where the whole Arthurian world has kind of fallen apart, and it ends in this shockingly inconclusive note where Arthur is still at war with this enemy who betrayed him, and that's never going to be resolved, and Perslesvaus himself leaves the mortal world and goes off on a boat, and then it cuts to like pilgrims finding the Grail in the castle in the end like some kind of haunting of the Grail that exists in the site of the Grail castle, and they become like hermits, and they say if you saw what we would saw, then you would do what we did, but it's fundamentally incommunicable. But anyway, there's a lot of weird stuff about temporality in the Perslesvaus, to be sure, like in the narrative structure of it. Like I said, it's very repetitive. There are all these strange, like it has all these constant bizarre fixation on severed heads, which I unfortunately couldn't fit into talking about, but there's a ton of them. And a friend once made like a chart of all of them. And the thing is, like, if you try to keep track of it, eventually realize that like the author mixes up the identity of several severed heads and dead bodies and stuff, and there's this fixation on mourning rituals and tombs and relics and so forth, and you know it's a very highly structured work in some point, because like there are all these elaborate subplots, and it does all kind of get wrapped in the end, except for the huge things that don't, and then like it has this shocking temporal break at the end, you know, so it's kind of like this collapse of the temporal structure. I was definitely thinking about, you know, these kinds of structures of time as being like related to structures of architecture, like the temple steps and stuff. You know, I remember that G.K. Chesterton saying something that like all medieval art is architectural or something like that. And so you have, and of course I did work on how the Song of Roland parallels the mystic arc that was imagined by Hugh of St. Victor and the architecture of the Abbey. And so, you know, with Perslesvaus, you have this sort of like glitch-like thing, you know, where it's like the minus level of a video game or something, where it's all wrong. And that's one of the things that makes it so fascinating. It's like this breakdown of temporality, because it's this like breakdown of how Christians understand their history and stuff, you know, because you have this apocalypse that has no end in sight, which again feels very relatable, and there's no guarantee of any kind of divine providence.
This is great. Are we ready for an audience question? So I have a question for Maggie. This is from Andrew Hill, who asks, I'm curious to know what you think about the idea of sequencing as it relates to the Gradual Psalms. I work on prayer texts in lesser-known 14th century French books of hours that contain the life of St. Margaret, and I'm wondering if the idea of the sequencing of texts figures into the arguments in your dissertation. For instance, what texts or images come directly before and after the texts/images you work on in the prayer book you study? And might they help you make sense of the prayer book in terms of daily use?
That's a really great question. And it's the answer is I know and I don't know. The book has been rebound at least 4 times, and there's some really strange things going on with the ordering. Like the begins with the calendar and then goes to the hours of the Virgin at Matins, and that's split in half. And then the last 3 canonical hours, it's just all spread out. But it is, the Gradual Psalms do come directly after the Office of the Dead, which is standard. If you're going to find the Gradual Psalms, it's probably going to be after the Office of the Dead. So I do think there is, that at least as a set was correct. The overall sequencing is a little bit harder to figure out, but it is relatively standard in that section of the book. It's in the part of the main volume where the standard texts are, and then are followed afterwards by masses. So it's a very helpful thing to see how it fits in with other Gradual Psalm sequencing, but it's also really hindered by the fact that this thing has been so messed with over multiple centuries and multiple owners.
Thank you. On behalf of the audience who is listening in, as well as on my own behalf, we have a question for Adrian from Michael Johnston. Could you speak more about the role of the Albigensian Crusade as a cause of trauma? Is there, for example, a noticeable uptick in the sorts of failed exegesis around supersession in this period, or is the Perslesvaus unique in reflecting the trauma from these events?
Well, thank you for asking that, because this was something I had to cut out of the paper, although maybe I didn't have to because we ended up having more time than we expected a little bit. But anyway, so the thing is that, yes, the Perslesvaus is in many ways a unique work in terms of what it's done. It's not like any other Arthurian romance or any other medieval work, but there are echoes of it elsewhere, where that, like, several other scholars have noted ethical discomfort with the Crusade in the main contemporary historical accounts, the Historia Albigensis of Peter of Vaucernay and the Chronica of William of Puylaurens, which I get into somewhat in my thesis. And the most startling is the versed epic, the Canso de Crosada, which it has not only all this violent imagery, but it's broken in two, where like the first half is written by someone who is pro-Crusade, and the second half is written by someone who is pro-Southern France. And so you have like this kind of like collapse and break in consciousness and narration. So the Perslesvaus is sort of like pulling all of that into one source. And so, it does sort of like, it expresses, I think, all these anxieties that are present under the surface in other sources.
Thank you. That's great. We have a question that's sort of addressed to everyone that notes first that it seems like all of the papers deal in some way with trauma. The first question is for Joanna, and it's about the relationship between considering one's own death or the poet's death in the Kalendarium to the trauma of martyrs commemorated in the calendar poem. Could these be linked in some way?
Do you want me to wait?
This is from Margaret Hadley.
Oh, thank you, Margaret. Do you want me to wait until the end? Or
No, go ahead.
Okay, so
it
is the speaker's, the supplicant's own like trauma that he's facing, thinking about his own death, how is it related to the martyr's trauma? Because he names so many of them and praises so many of them. I would say the strongest trauma, or like anything that sort of approaches it in the poem, has to do with kind of conventional, this life is so hard stuff, rather than fear of like a grisly death. And I also think that, oh no, my internet connection is unstable. Let me know if I cut out and I'll stop my video and keep talking. What was it? Oh, so it's in a sense kind of all written from the perspective of eternity, where all has already been made well in some strange, odd way. And then the things that are so hard and scary and rough right now are like how to live in this life. So I do get, to me, it does sound like an older person who feels very much in the thick of things that are hard and not good, you know, as a kind of like aspirational poem, like trying to concentrate on positive things and trying to associate oneself with, to remind oneself that others have already come through difficult times, as opposed to like trying to get the two traumas to meet each other.
Makes sense. Thank you. Margaret Hadley also has a question for Maggie. Maggie noted the depiction of Susanna's traumatic story in an illustrated gradual psalm cycle. Would you speak to other pictorial references to trauma in the illuminated programs of any other medieval psalm, Ascent psalm texts?
To be honest, they're not that many. That is in the De Braille's Hours, which is pretty unique in how it depicts the gradual psalms. And apologies, my at-hand knowledge of the full context of the De Braille's Hours is failing me slightly. But that book, it has particular connotations with St. Lawrence and with Susanna. So there is something very particular about that manuscript going on. But often if you do see miniature openings to the gradual psalms, it might just be someone in prayer. That's another form. But I think Susanna is kind of the standout in terms of that traumatic imagery. But you just don't see that many. So it's something that I will keep an eye out going forward.
Thank you. I'd like to just follow up on Joanna, your recent answer and ask a little more about how, if at all, the narrator of the calendar poem represents himself in time. I mean, you described sort of thinking that this seems like someone who's considering his own mortality, who's thinking about trying to sort of reconcile himself to this. But are there other ways in which he positions himself in either his own life or in history?
That's a fantastic question, and I need to go back and read the whole thing with that in mind now. Let's see, how does he position himself in relation to time? Well, this would lead back into a sort of the whole face in the form kind of answer, and I don't want to bore everyone too much, but there are the weave between the present moment as experienced in the present and the present moment as imagined from the perspective of eternity is so like finely achieved. Or I guess you could also make the argument that it's sort of just chaotic and it's present in both senses in different ways in rapid succession. But it's almost as if the narrator knows that he will be coming back to this spot again in a year. So it's not just sort of like his stance in the present is like, oh, this life is hard and I'm working on my virtuous habits and I'm, worried about death and I'm trying to pray for people I care about. And then imagining sort of like pie in the sky, there's also this sense of return to like the beginning of the year or like the day of each month over and over again that comes out through the kind of double-endedness where you're not quite sure where the like actions or the requests are being made, in which direction they're being made. So that's a kind of a complicated attempt at a like formal answer, but in terms of like what he actually says, there are no reference that I'm aware of to like historical events that have taken place, because it's so deep. I mean, other than the like associations with each of the saints that are addressed. Yeah, but if anything comes out over the next year of research, I will write to you personally to let you know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this relationship between a present and some other time seems also very at issue in all of the texts and objects you all are talking about. We have another audience question for Adrian from Josh Timmerman. Have you been able to identify any patristic, apart from Josephus, if he is being counted as a father, or perhaps early medieval precedents for some of these distinctive exegetical ideas, or for this particular type of supersessionist theology that you've detected in this text?
Well, that's a big question. I'll admit I haven't had a chance to look into it as much. I've mostly been focusing on its contemporary context. I will say that in some ways, it does represent a rather startling, although not untypical, break from Augustine one way, in that it's very strongly focused on ghosts, whereas Augustine felt that, he very strongly looked down on the actual existence of ghosts and felt like Christians shouldn't bother with that. But a lot of medieval preachers kind of threw that out the window because, ghost stories were useful for them because it was this sort of obvious and accessible proof of the afterlife. And so you see a lot of ghost stories in the medieval exemplary literature and stuff, and the Dialogus Miraculorum, which has a lot of intertextuality with the Perslesvaus, this book of Cistercian exempla, which can be put into sermons, and that's the reason why Perslesvaus has so many ghosts as compared to other Arthurian romances and other medieval romances like that. There are some other Arthurian ghosts, notably, of course, there's the Aventurus of Arthur, where Guinevere encounters her mother's sinful ghost, but in the Perslesvaus, it has a ton of them. It basically has, everything it has as much of it as it possibly can. So, and I don't really think it has an organized theology, but it does seem to be in dialogue with a lot of Cistercian things. As I said, that there's this sort of garbled version of Cistercian preaching that in the opening episode of the Chapel Ride, for example, you have Arthur encountering a dead robber and hearing the angels and the demons arguing over his soul, and like I said, all of that seems to come from monastic exempla. So I don't think that there's a lot of direct influence on patristic theology, and if there was, it would have come through that. Okay.
Thank you. And another audience question for Maggie. Thank you to the unseen audience for your wonderful questions. Costanza Beltrami asks, I would like to ask Maggie if Philip the Bold would have asked for the inclusion of the staircase iconography in the manuscript.
Yeah, it's a question that I'm constantly grappling with and interested in. So I think the answer might be yes, but not directly. We know a whole lot about when the manuscript was commissioned. We know that the first payment was made in September 1376 for 200 leave to his confessor to go have the manuscript made on his behalf. And it was a Dominican confessor named Guillaume de Bellem. And so on one side, you have this figure who is actually the mediator between the person he's in charge of devotionally and religiously, and then the patron of the manuscript. But then in my paper, I talked about this other circle of manuscripts being made, and how Charles V, for instance, added all these texts to the Savoy Hours, which has a really important textual link with Philip's Book of Hours. There's very specific masses that were meant to be read in the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris that only appear in this small group of Valois manuscripts. And he's adding the Gradual Psalms into the Savoy Hours, an early 14th century manuscript. So I think he's probably drawing on sort of a combination of wanting to do what his brother the king is doing and adding into his very fancy manuscript, and then also saying to his confessor, go make me a massive 2-volume Book of Hours that's gonna suit all my devotional needs. So I think it's a both question.
Thanks. Another kind of group question. You've all touched on this a bit already, but it's interesting to me that we have 3 very different objects of inquiry here to which you're asking some similar questions: an image associated with a text, a narrative text, and this kind of experimental non-narrative long poem. Thinking about each other's objects of inquiry as well as your own, do you all have any thoughts at this point about the kind of particular relation of the medium or the form of the thing that you're talking about to its particular kind of complicated set of temporalities?
Well, when I think about its own complicated set of temporalities, the thing that comes to mind is sort of like the pressures like on the moment of the objects, like formation, and then different moments during its reception, I guess. So is that, I guess it's hard to know if that's what the question asker intended, but
I think about what you've talked about this a fair amount already, but how the particular kind of non-narrative form allows it to think about time in relation to how the narrative poem thinks about time and how the image thinks about time. If any of you have any further thoughts on that.
My paper derives from one chapter that's about time and space. And so this is, an excerpt on one particular text and how it relates and kind of drives a daily devotional aspect. But I'm very interested in how time is compressed and expanded, because it's just one text in a book that is dictating when you're supposed to be reading things at particular times, and by someone who's almost certainly not reading those texts at those particular times. So how do you engage with what you're meant to do and what you're supposed to do at different time?
Okay, I'm not really sure what to say about that in relation to the Perslesvaus, because it has as I said, a very weird relationship to time and also space. One thing I alluded to but didn't get into is that it's explicitly said that the landscape changes over the course of the poem, that like when they go back to a location, it won't necessarily be the same, and that's because of like the will of God allowing them to have different adventures. So it's this very weird, mutable world, but also this world full of recursion, and as to how it relates to its medium, it's very interesting, like to compare it to other Arthurian romances, because of course this is sort of like a very stark and striking counterpoint to a lot of the cyclical romances that were being written around this time, like the more orthodox Ceste-Saint-Gall, where it was this almost like architectural pattern where they were each pieces of like a wider whole, whereas in this case it's very much like the piece that doesn't fit. It has all these events that don't correspond to other Arthurian narratives. It has Guinevere dies before the end of the kingdom, that the Arthur has a son who ends up being killed by Sir Kay, and all kinds of things, that it doesn't, it's this sort of, almost alternative timeline of the Arthurian narrative. And it's something that can't really be absorbed into the larger narrative. And so that's part of why it sort of it feels like a traumatic text. That's like, it's this experience that can't be assimilated, although it has had this kind of influence in some ways, that like the episode of the Chapel Perilous in Mallory probably came from that. So yeah.
I got
all
one.
right, well, thank you all. Oh yeah.
No,
Yeah, go ahead.
Just like a quick note in case anybody got sort of dorkily interested in metrical calendars. It's a surprisingly old form and a surprisingly English form, according to Michael Lappage. The first one comes out in like the 8th century, I think, and then the 9th century, and then the 10th century, and then it sort of goes to the continent, he believes, from England. So so I guess that's one sort of, it's nice to think about the particular object in relation to everything that sort of came before it, because it is participating in many of the conventions, but it's still offering something that's like interesting enough for us to pick it out to want to talk about.
Right, so particular kind of metrical calendar, a particular kind of weird atemporal romance, and a particular kind of, yeah. We are pretty close to the end of our time slot. What remains, I think, is to thank the audience for being here, and to thank the three of you very much for sharing your work with me and with each other and with all of us under such extremely difficult circumstances, both here in the present of this panel and in general, the circumstances that are the reason we can't all fly to the same place. So thank you again. Good wishes to all of you. And to everyone participating. The rest of the program for the virtual MAA is on the Medieval Academy of America website. So please do consider going to some of the remaining sessions as well.